UD tonight. You gave a lecture about gender, class, and climate change.
Just giving folks an introduction to what climate change is, and also explaining how there are disparate impacts on the poor, on working people, and on women because of the kinds of work that they do, because of doing caretaking labor, because of not having the same economic, educational resources. And that's true especially in the developing world, but it's certainly true in the developed world as well.
So you connect climate justice with human rights and feminism with human rights. I think there are a lot of people in the audience today that had never considered women's rights as part of human rights.
Yeah.
But you know, all the issues that we are dealing with climate change, with race, with class issues, with sexism and homophobia and all these other things, would you say that all of those things are part of human rights and they are all connected if we want justice in the society?
You know, human rights is a useful way for framing the issues and for highlighting the connections among different issues. Because, of course, if you believe that there are fundamental human rights that everyone shares, and also that different categories of identity and social class are part of what keep folks from enjoying their full human rights, then you can kind of see all the connections. And caring about human rights is kind of a motivator to care about women, care about feminist issues, care about poverty. But I also worry because the whole framing of human rights has become a kind of legal framing and a legalistic framing, when I think it was originally meant more to call up, like, you know, sort of a basic fundamental respect. So it gets, the human rights discourse can get kind of overused in a way that actually desensitizes folks. So I think it's important to highlight it, but then to also talk about all of the particulars. So the material and economic advantages that people don't have, the educational needs, and also just the need for general, you know, empowerment isn't something that you can grant someone as a human right. That's about giving someone autonomy and giving them the resources that they need to enact their autonomy. So recognizing someone's human rights might actually be about granting them the space to act in ways that, you know, you might not approve of.
Would you think that education is really at the basis of that?
Well, it certainly is a fundamental. It's a fundamental, absolutely.
We had some questions in the audience. A gentleman from Bangladesh or India?
My family's from Bangladesh.
Okay. Talking about how Western groups, feminist groups, climate change groups try to go into other countries and tell them how they should be doing things when we're not necessarily doing things that way. And also neglecting to recognize the socioeconomic things that they have to deal with. Not necessarily, climate change might not be on their minds as something that's immediate like it is here for some of us when they have to deal with issues of poverty and things like that. So how can we be sensitive but also help, you know, make them recognize that we all need to be working on this together.
Yeah, you know, so in some ways it's like kind of none of, I mean, I'm not a policymaker, so it's not really any of my business how a Bangladeshi community manages adaptation to climate change, except I can pressure the policymakers in the very powerful nation that I live in to, you know, to do things the right way, and I can also try to connect with those communities if it's appropriate through the grassroots level or by kind of helping to build a grassroots global movement that's attentive to climate justice. So in some ways, I just want to kind of question the whole framework of like, what do we think about what they ought to do over there or something like that. It's their business. Except, what if we created a problem that other folks, quote unquote, over there have to deal with, or that's killing folks over there? Then we have a responsibility both to stop causing the harm. As you said, first plan of action is reducing our own greenhouse gas emissions, stop contributing to the harm, but then also how to mitigate and take care of the harms that we've caused. And so the obvious ways of doing that is through international aid. So if international aid is part of the answer for a nation like Bangladesh that's, going to suffer severely from flooding, if, on top of other things in relation to climate change. So then how should decisions about how that aid gets filtered down to communities, or who participates in the technology transfer, or who helps to make decisions about, or who's eligible for having their community projects financed, right? So feminists who are working in the UN system, feminists from all over the world, are working very hard to argue to make sure that women and women from impacted communities are involved, are at the table when those sorts of decisions are made, right? So instead of, so we argue that yes, it's our moral responsibility to pay climate reparations. I prefer that than climate aid, but to pay climate reparations, that's our responsibility. But also we have a responsibility to make sure that all the impacted parties are at the table, and also that they have the resources to be at the table in a way that is effective. So back to the importance of education and empowerment and feeling like, your voice matters and all of that.
All right, thank you.
Climate change is an ethical issue of epic proportions, for it endangers everything on Earth that human beings depend upon and care about. It's also a very difficult set of practical problems, for climate change has emerged from powerful and deeply entrenched economic and social norms and practices, and it's laden with unpredictable unknowns. It's also an urgent issue, and this urgency should shape our ideas about what ought to be done about it, and by whom. Climate change is also a matter of global social justice. The greatest power to bring down greenhouse gas levels rests in the most privileged societies, like the one that we're sitting in right now. But assessments all emphasize the fact that the impacts of climate change are already falling first and most heavily on the poorest and most vulnerable people around the world. As a case in point, in 2010, high Atlantic Ocean temperatures contributed to the intense monsoons that led to catastrophic flooding in Pakistan, causing over 2,000 deaths, but displacing 20 million people, 85% of whom were women and children. Right, that tells you who the poor is, right? The World Health Organization has estimated that 150,000 human deaths annually are attributable to climatic changes. By dumping harmful waste into our common atmosphere, the world's wealthiest nations and the privileged elite and industry-owning sectors of nearly every nation have endangered everyone, human and non-human, including those who have contributed little or nothing at all to the industrial greenhouse effect. The least developed nations, the natural world, and future generations who will bear the larger brunt. Historically responsible for climate change, this graph kind of gives us the answer. And we can see that the US is the largest single emitter cumulatively. So this is an American problem. So the US, given technology development and other development of green technologies and mitigation efforts, the US is expected to remain fairly flat. You see, I mean, most of the developed world is expected to remain fairly flat, and then here's China. Right? And even if we look at emissions now in 2005, here's where China was in 1990. Right? And here's where China is now. So in December, when the Conference of the Parties happened, these big international climate change conferences happen, you will suddenly, if they're in the news, you'll see a lot of talk about the US and China as a main player in negotiations, because China is considered, of course, a developing nation, not a developed nation that already made its wealth on burning fossil fuels and emitting greenhouse gases. And so if a nation, the Kyoto Protocol allows developing nations to develop without stringent mitigation rules in order for them to kind of become an equal economic player. So it's a complicated moral problem in terms of responsibility for past contributions to harms, but also thinking about present and future contributions. Here's a graph of predicted changes in precipitation by the end of the 21st century. So what does that loss of precipitation, or those changes in precipitation, mean? Well, this map shows you projected changes in agricultural productivity by the year 2080 with business as usual. So if you don't engage in serious mitigation practices within the next 10 to 15 years, this, some scientists believe, is the likely scenario. The areas that are red are projected to experience a 50% reduction in agricultural productivity. The places that are dark green, and you see there aren't a lot of dark green. Scandinavia, the northern US, right? Some parts of China. That's not even dark green there in New Zealand. But the dark green is not a 50% increase in agricultural productivity. It's a 15 to 35% increase. Right? And look how much red there is. So look at what this tells us about possibilities of migration, food scarcity, disease vectors. Now that's not a picture of, we don't know that that's a picture of poor people, right? So that's not a picture of a class impact. However, if you look at that impact, you know that the people with the least amount of resources will be the most impacted overall by a severe situation like this. These are the activity profiles for agricultural production by gender in Nepal and India. This is how much work, 14 hours of work, that the women do in women-headed household. This is how much the men do in men-headed migrant or non-migrant households. 2.25. Right. So this is how. So I really don't know. You know, they're obviously outsourcing some of their work, right? To who? Their mothers, right? The neighbor lady, something, right? But so that I am powerful. That's this. That's on the backs of those girls, right? And we have to remember that empowering. And to use Martha Nussbaum's terms, like helping to increase the capacities of folks who are dealing with these extraordinary challenges needs to be for their own good, right? And not just sort of instrumental so that their communities can then enter the global market. Right, so I would argue that we need to kind of beware of sort of an overemphasis on just the neoliberal line about the work of women and girls contributing to development, especially when they don't really have that power. So if we are talking about empowering women and girls so that they can better help their communities and help themselves to deal with ecological pressures, does that not have to be accompanied by general efforts to empower women regarding their own lives in every possible way, and politically as well? So, and let's not lose the importance of this side of the picture. Why are we not comfortable regulating the pollution into our common atmosphere that is all that we have and all that our future generations will have?
You mentioned at the beginning that you were going to be addressing how to
involved in a number of ways. What I argue is that it's very important that we get involved politically. And just reducing your individual greenhouse, your greenhouse gas emissions, just reducing your carbon footprint is not enough. It's not enough because mathematically it's not enough. If everyone on planet Earth stopped driving cars tomorrow, we would not adequately address climate change. Because there is the emissions levels at the corporate, governmental, military, at those levels, they are so extraordinary that in fact, your driving your car is a drop in the bucket. So we really need change at a higher level above our individual actions. So I'm not arguing, and I would never argue that your individual actions are not important, and we waste so much energy, and that is just, that's just wrong. So becoming mindful of how we use energy, how we waste it, we need to reduce our consumption, but that is not going to make any difference unless the higher level decision makers, unless corporations are changing their policies, unless governments are implementing their policies, and unless there are effective treaties at the international level.